Have you ever noticed that strange pattern? How often do we hear someone say, "It's God's will," or "God has a plan," precisely when they're facing a difficult decision or avoiding a necessary change? It's one of those peculiar human behaviors that hides in plain sight. Think of the last time you heard someone invoke divine providence. Was it during moments of triumph and joy? Or was it more likely during moments of loss, confusion, or when facing a challenging crossroads? There's something almost suspicious about this pattern, a convenient correlation that warrants deeper investigation. When we look closely at how people use religious language in everyday life, a puzzling pattern emerges. The language of God's plan seems to appear most frequently not as an expression of genuine spiritual insight, but as a linguistic shield against uncertainty and the responsibility of choice. It's as if we've collectively discovered the perfect universal excuse, one that can't be questioned, challenged, or disproven. After all, who can argue against God's mysterious ways? This strange relationship between divine will and human inaction isn't new. It spans centuries, cultures, and religions. But what's truly fascinating is how rarely we examine this psychological mechanism. What if one of religion's most powerful functions isn't spiritual enlightenment at all, but rather providing the ultimate psychological comfort, freedom from the burden of choice? The uncomfortable question lurking beneath this pattern is disturbing. Have we been using God, not primarily as a path to truth, but as the perfect excuse to avoid change, growth, and the terrifying responsibility of creating our own meaning? What if our invocations of divine will are often less about piety and more about fear? Fear of choosing wrongly, fear of the unknown, fear of taking full responsibility for our lives. This isn't merely an academic question. It strikes at the heart of how we live, how we make decisions, and how we understand our place in the world. If we've been hiding behind divine will to avoid the discomfort of change, what might become possible if we stepped out from behind that shield? What version of yourself might emerge if you stopped outsourcing your life's most important decisions to a higher power? And who better to guide us through this uncomfortable territory than a man who spent his life examining the psychological foundations of religious belief? A philosopher who dared to ask whether our holiest concepts might actually be serving very human, all too human purposes. What if I told you that, over a century ago, one of history's most penetrating minds uncovered this pattern and traced its implications to their unsettling conclusion? A thinker who recognized that behind our most sacred invocations of divine will often lurks something much more mundane, the simple desire to avoid the discomfort of change and the anxiety of freedom. What might we learn by following his investigation? Why do we find it so much easier to say, "It's all part of God's plan," than to face the terrifying possibility that there might be no predetermined plan at all? Just our own choices, our own responsibility, and the meaning we ourselves create. Could it be that the concept of divine will serves as the perfect psychological mechanism for avoiding the fundamental burden of human existence? The answers to these questions might challenge your most basic assumptions about faith, meaning, and responsibility. Are you ready to follow where they lead? There's a peculiar pattern in human behavior that becomes visible once you start looking for it. A pattern so common that it hides in plain sight, camouflaged by its very ubiquity. It emerges in phrases we've all heard countless times. It's all part of God's plan. God works in mysterious ways. It's God's will. If God wants it to happen, it will happen. These expressions aren't random spiritual musings. They follow a specific and predictable pattern. They appear most frequently at precisely those moments when we face difficult choices, uncertain futures, or the necessity of painful change. Consider how these phrases emerge in our lives. The woman who remains in an unfulfilling marriage because God hates divorce. The man who stays in a soul-crushing job because this must be the cross God wants me to bear. The talented artist who never pursues their passion because God hasn't opened that door. The community that refuses to address injustice because God has ordained the social order. In each case, divine will conveniently aligns with the path of least resistance, the avoidance of difficult change. What makes this pattern truly revealing isn't its occasional appearance but its remarkable consistency across time and cultures. From ancient civilizations to modern societies, humans have invoked divine will as a shield against the anxiety of choice. The specific deity changes, the theological details shift, but the psychological function remains strikingly consistent. Divine determinism provides the perfect excuse not to change, not to choose, not to act. This pattern becomes even more intriguing when we notice its asymmetrical application. When good things happen, promotions, recoveries, windfalls, we often attribute them to our own efforts, skills, and decisions. But when facing difficult choices or painful circumstances, divine will suddenly becomes the primary explanatory framework. This selective attribution reveals something profound about how we use the concept of God psychologically. The anomaly extends beyond individual psychology into institutional contexts. Religious organizations often invoke divine authority precisely when their traditions face challenges or calls for reform. This is what God has ordained becomes the perfect conversation stopper when questions arise about gender roles, sexuality, wealth distribution, or institutional power. The pattern repeats. Divine will is invoked most fervently when change threatens the status quo. What's particularly striking about this pattern is how rarely we acknowledge it explicitly. We discuss theology, ritual, doctrine, and belief at length, but we seldom examine this specific psychological function of religious language. It's as if we've collectively agreed not to notice how conveniently divine will aligns with our desire to avoid difficult choices and uncomfortable change. And that's where our investigation truly begins, with the recognition that one of religion's most powerful functions might not be connecting us to the divine at all, but rather providing the perfect psychological mechanism for avoiding the fundamental responsibility of human existence, the responsibility to choose, to act, to create meaning in an uncertain world. What if God's will has become, for many, primarily a shield against the anxiety of freedom? This is the question that haunted a 19th-century philosopher whose insights into human psychology were so profound, so disturbing, that they continue to challenge us today. A man who dared to ask whether our most sacred concepts might actually be serving very human, all too human purposes. What did Friedrich Nietzsche discover about this strange relationship between divine will and human inaction? And why does his discovery remain so unsettling more than a century later? In the autumn of 1879, a sickly 35-year-old Friedrich Nietzsche found himself in a small rented room in the Swiss village of St. Moritz. He had recently resigned his professorship at the University of Basel due to debilitating health issues, violent headaches, nausea, and failing eyesight that often left him confined to darkened rooms for days. His official academic career was over, his books largely ignored by the intellectual establishment. By conventional standards, Nietzsche's life appeared to be falling apart. It was during this period of physical suffering and social isolation that Nietzsche began to formulate his most penetrating insights about the psychological functions of religious belief. His personal circumstances provided a unique vantage point. Having grown up as the son of a Lutheran pastor, who had died when Friedrich was only 4, Nietzsche had intimate knowledge of Christian faith from the inside. Yet his philological training and growing skepticism had led him to view religious beliefs through an increasingly psychological lens. What made Nietzsche's perspective especially valuable wasn't merely his philosophical brilliance, but the convergence of his personal experience with his intellectual journey. Here was a man intimately familiar with suffering, with the temptation to find comfort in predetermined meaning. Each day, as physical pain racked his body, he faced the choice between seeking refuge in comforting metaphysical explanations or confronting the possibility that his suffering had no inherent meaning beyond what he himself might create. During his daily walks in the alpine landscape, taken during brief respites from his physical ailments, Nietzsche would contemplate how religious concepts functioned in human psychology. He noticed something that few had articulated before: how often the language of God's will seemed to appear precisely when humans faced difficult choices or painful circumstances that demanded personal responsibility. In his small notebooks, filled with his increasingly difficult-to-read handwriting, Nietzsche began to develop what would become one of his most disturbing insights: that many of our most sacred concepts might actually serve as psychological mechanisms for avoiding the fundamental responsibility of human existence. God, he suspected, had become for many not the path to truth, but the perfect excuse to avoid change, growth, and the terrifying freedom of creating one's own meaning. What made this insight especially powerful was that it didn't come from abstract theorizing, but from Nietzsche's own wrestling with suffering and meaning. Each day, as he faced physical pain with uncertain prospects for improvement, he confronted the temptation to explain his suffering through some divine plan or cosmic purpose. Each day, he rejected that comfort in favor of something much harder, taking responsibility for creating meaning in his circumstances, however difficult they might be. It was this personal confrontation with the temptation of predetermined meaning that gave Nietzsche's philosophical insights their unusual penetration and emotional force. He wasn't merely analyzing religious concepts academically, he was uncovering their psychological function through his own lived experience. As he would later write in Ex Homo, "Philosophy, as I have understood and lived it so far, is a voluntary living in ice and high mountains." This is the context from which Nietzsche would develop his unsettling analysis of how humans use the concept of God's will as a shield against the anxiety of choice and the burden of creating their own meaning. It wasn't merely an abstract critique of religion, but a profound psychological insight into how we use metaphysical concepts to avoid the fundamental responsibility of human existence. What evidence did Nietzsche find for this disturbing psychological pattern? And what implications might his discovery have for how we understand not just religion, but our relationship to choice, change, and personal responsibility? Nietzsche's first breakthrough came through his meticulous examination of religious language in everyday use. With the careful eye of a trained philologist, he began documenting how people actually employed concepts like God's will or divine plan in their daily lives. What he discovered was a striking pattern that few had bothered to notice. The invocation of divine will occurred most frequently, not during moments of spiritual insight, but rather during moments of personal crisis, difficult decision-making, or when facing the necessity of painful change. In his 1881 work, Daybreak, Thoughts on the Prejudices of Morality, Nietzsche offered his initial observations of this pattern. When misfortune strikes us, we can overcome it either by removing its cause, or else by changing the effect it has on our feelings. That is, by reinterpreting the misfortune as a good, whose benefit may only later become clear. He noted that religion excels at this second approach, reinterpreting situations to remove the burden of action from human shoulders. What made this observation so penetrating wasn't merely identifying the comfort that religious belief provides, which many had acknowledged before, but recognizing its specific psychological function. How divine determinism conveniently removes the anxiety of choice and the burden of personal responsibility. The language of God's plan doesn't just provide comfort, it provides the perfect excuse not to change, not to choose, not to act. Nietzsche found evidence for this pattern in the religious practices he observed around him. He noted how people would seek God's guidance most fervently precisely when facing life's most difficult crossroads, career changes, relationship decisions, moral dilemmas. Rather than seeing this as simple piety, he recognized it as a psychological mechanism for transferring the burden of choice away from oneself. If God makes the decision, after all, one cannot be blamed for the outcome. This insight gained further support from Nietzsche's historical studies. Looking at the development of religious doctrines across time, he noticed how concepts of divine providence and predestination had evolved to address precisely the existential anxiety that comes with human freedom and responsibility. The more emphasis a theological system placed on divine determination of events, the more it relieved humans of the burden of creating meaning and taking responsibility for their choices. Perhaps most compelling was Nietzsche's observation of the asymmetrical application of divine attribution. In Human, All Too Human, he wrote, "Men have at all times believed that where there was happiness, joy, or agreement, a God was present. Yet he noticed that this attribution worked selectively. When good things happened, people might thank God but still took partial credit. When facing difficult choices or painful circumstances, suddenly divine will became the primary explanatory framework, relieving individuals of responsibility. This selective attribution revealed something profound about how the concept of God functioned psychologically. It wasn't applied consistently as a metaphysical explanation, but deployed strategically to manage the anxiety of human choice and responsibility. God's will appeared most useful precisely when it aligned with our desire to avoid difficult decisions, painful growth, or challenging circumstances. What makes this evidence so compelling isn't any single instance, but the consistent pattern across individual psychology, institutional behavior, and historical development. The concept of God's will seems to function with remarkable consistency as a shield against the anxiety of choice and the responsibility of creating meaning in an uncertain world. But what deeper patterns might we uncover as we continue this investigation? And what implications might these patterns have for how we understand our relationship to choice, change, and personal responsibility? What if Nietzsche's discovery reveals not just a quirk of religious psychology, but a profound insight into how we avoid the fundamental challenge of human existence? As Nietzsche deepened his investigation, he discovered that this psychological pattern extended far beyond explicit religious language. Even in seemingly secular contexts, he found the same underlying mechanism at work: the displacement of responsibility away from human choice onto external authorities or abstract principles. The specific language might change, but the psychological function remained consistent, avoiding the burden of choice and the anxiety of freedom. In Beyond Good and Evil, published in 1886, Nietzsche expanded his analysis. The desire for freedom of will in the superlative metaphysical sense, the desire to bear the entire and ultimate responsibility for one's actions oneself, and to absolve God, the world, ancestors, chance and society therefrom, involves nothing less than to be precisely this causa sui and to pull oneself up into existence by the hair, out of the swamps of nothingness. This passage reveals Nietzsche's growing recognition that the issue wasn't merely religious language, but a deeper human tendency to avoid the fundamental responsibility of creating meaning. Whether through God's will, social determinism, biological destiny, or economic necessity, humans found countless ways to displace responsibility away from their own choices. What made this insight especially powerful was Nietzsche's recognition that this avoidance strategy wasn't merely individual, but had become systematized in moral frameworks, philosophical systems, and social institutions. In On the Genealogy of Morals, he traced how entire moral systems had evolved to displace responsibility away from human choice and onto transcendent authorities, God, reason, nature, social consensus, that conveniently removed the burden of creating values. The pattern became clear. Humans had developed increasingly sophisticated systems for avoiding the fundamental anxiety of freedom and the burden of creating meaning in a world without predetermined purpose. The concept of God's will wasn't merely a theological doctrine, but a psychological mechanism for managing this existential anxiety. This insight allowed Nietzsche to recognize something that few had articulated before: that the real power of religious belief might lie not in its metaphysical claims, but in its psychological function, providing the perfect excuse not to change, not to choose, not to face the terrifying freedom of creating one's own meaning. God had become for many primarily a shield against the anxiety of freedom. As Nietzsche continued his investigation, he found evidence for this pattern in countless domains of human life. In politics, where appeal to divine ordination justified existing power structures. In ethics, where divine command theory removed the burden of creating values. In personal life, where God's plan provided the perfect excuse for avoiding difficult choices and necessary changes. What made this insight so disturbing wasn't that it challenged religious belief itself, many had done that before, but that it revealed how deeply our avoidance of responsibility had become embedded in our cultural, psychological, and institutional frameworks. The excuse, "God wanted it this way," hadn't merely shaped individual choices, but had structured entire civilizations' approaches to meaning, responsibility, and change. This recognition led Nietzsche to one of his most profound and challenging questions. What might become possible if we stopped using God or other external authorities as excuses and instead embraced the full responsibility of creating meaning in a world without predetermined purpose. What version of humanity might emerge if we stepped out from behind the shield of divine will and faced the terrifying freedom of choice? As we continue our investigation, we'll explore how Nietzsche's insights reveal not just a quirk of religious psychology, but a profound pattern that shapes how we approach choice, change, and personal responsibility. What evidence did he find for this pattern in our cultural institutions? And what implications might his discovery have for how we live in a world increasingly uncertain about traditional sources of meaning and value? As Nietzsche continued his investigation, a striking pattern emerged across diverse domains of human experience. The use of God's will as an excuse for avoiding difficult changes wasn't isolated to individual psychology, but had become embedded in social institutions, cultural practices, and even philosophical systems. The pattern was consistent. Wherever humans faced the anxiety of choice and the burden of responsibility, they developed mechanisms for displacing that burden onto external authorities, with divine will serving as the perfect universal excuse. In The Gay Science, Nietzsche articulated this pattern with characteristic clarity. God is dead, but given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown. And we still have to vanquish his shadow too. This famous passage points to Nietzsche's recognition that even as traditional religious belief declined, the psychological mechanism it served, avoiding the responsibility of creating meaning, continued to operate through other channels. The pattern revealed itself in politics, where appeals to divine ordination justified existing power structures and resistance to reform. The divine right of kings wasn't merely a theological doctrine, but a psychological mechanism for avoiding the responsibility of creating just social arrangements. Even as societies secularized, Nietzsche observed how the same psychological function continued through appeals to natural order, tradition, or the way things have always been, different language, serving the same function of avoiding the responsibility of conscious social creation. In ethics, the pattern appeared in divine command theory, which conveniently displaced the burden of creating values onto divine authority. Nietzsche noted how even supposedly secular ethical systems continued this pattern through appeals to reason, nature, or consensus that served the same psychological function, avoiding the terrifying freedom of creating values in a world without predetermined moral order. Perhaps most revealing was how this pattern manifested in personal life decisions. Nietzsche observed how individuals would invoke God's plan precisely when facing life's most difficult crossroads, career changes, relationship decisions, moral dilemmas. Rather than recognizing this as a psychological mechanism for avoiding responsibility, it was interpreted as the highest form of piety. What made this pattern so powerful wasn't any single instance, but its remarkable consistency across domains. Whether in politics, ethics, or personal life, the same psychological mechanism operated, displacing the burden of choice and the anxiety of freedom onto external authorities that conveniently removed the responsibility of conscious creation. This recognition led Nietzsche to one of his most penetrating insights, that behind many of our most sacred concepts often lurks something much more mundane, the simple desire to avoid the discomfort of change and the anxiety of freedom. God's will had become, for many, primarily a shield against the fundamental challenge of human existence, creating meaning in a world without predetermined purpose. As this pattern became increasingly clear, Nietzsche began to recognize its profound implications. What if many of our cultural institutions, moral frameworks, and psychological habits had evolved primarily to shield us from the anxiety of freedom and the burden of creating meaning? What if the concept of divine will served not primarily as a path to truth, but as the perfect excuse for avoiding the fundamental responsibility of human existence? This recognition wasn't merely an academic observation, but a profound challenge to how we understand ourselves and our relationship to choice, change, and personal responsibility. If we've been using God or other external authorities primarily as shields against the anxiety of freedom, what might become possible if we stepped out from behind those shields and embraced the full responsibility of creating meaning in a world without predetermined purpose? As we continue our investigation, we'll explore the deeper implications of Nietzsche's discovery, What does it mean for how we approach personal growth, social change, and the creation of meaning in an increasingly uncertain world? And what might it reveal about the psychological patterns that continue to shape our lives, even as traditional religious belief declines? The implications of Nietzsche's discovery reach far beyond religious criticism into the very heart of how we understand human psychology, ethics, and the possibility of authentic personal growth. If one of religion's most powerful functions has been providing the perfect excuse not to change, then addressing this pattern requires more than merely questioning religious belief. It demands a fundamental reconsideration of how we approach responsibility, meaning, and personal transformation. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche explored these implications through his concept of the three metamorphoses of the spirit, from camel to lion to child. The camel represents the spirit that bears the weight of external values and predetermined meaning. The lion represents the courage to say no to external authorities and create space for something new. The child represents the capacity for genuine creation, for saying yes to life and taking responsibility for creating new values. This framework reveals Nietzsche's profound insight. Moving beyond the use of God's will as an excuse requires more than intellectual rejection of religious concepts. It demands the courage to face the anxiety of freedom and the creative capacity to generate meaning without the comfort of predetermined purpose. The real challenge isn't disbelief, but the terrifying responsibility that comes with recognizing there may be no predetermined plan, just our own choices, our own responsibility, and the meaning we ourselves create. The first profound implication is psychological. If we've been using God's will as a shield against the anxiety of freedom, then authentic personal growth requires facing that anxiety directly, rather than seeking refuge in predetermined meaning. As Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil, the thought of suicide is a powerful comfort. It helps one through many a dreadful night. Similarly, the thought that everything happens according to a divine plan provides comfort, but at the cost of authentic engagement with life's fundamental challenges. The second implication is ethical. If moral systems have functioned partly to displace responsibility away from human choice, then genuine ethical maturity requires taking full responsibility for creating values rather than seeking refuge in external authorities. This doesn't mean arbitrary or selfish value creation, but rather the mature recognition that values emerge from human needs, experiences, and aspirations, not from transcendent commandments that conveniently remove the burden of moral creation. The third implication is social. If appeals to divine ordination have served partly to justify existing power structures and resist necessary changes, then social progress requires recognizing human responsibility for creating just arrangements rather than accepting traditional orders as divinely ordained. This doesn't mean naive utopianism, but rather the mature recognition that social arrangements emerge from human choices and can be consciously reshaped to better serve human flourishing. Perhaps the most profound implication is existential. If we've been using the concept of predetermined meaning primarily as a shield against the anxiety of freedom, then authentic living requires embracing that anxiety rather than seeking refuge in comforting illusions. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, the greatest weight. What if some day or night a demon were to steal into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, the eternal hourglass of existence is turned over again and again, and you with it, a dust grain of dust. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, you are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine? This famous passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that authentic living requires embracing the full weight of existence without the comfort of a predetermined meaning, a terrifying prospect that many avoid through appeals to divine will or cosmic purpose. The real challenge isn't questioning God's existence, but facing the responsibility that comes with recognizing there may be no predetermined plan guiding our lives. What does this mean for how we approach personal growth, social change, and the creation of meaning in an increasingly uncertain world? And what might it reveal about the psychological patterns that continue to shape our lives, even as traditional religious belief declines? The pattern Nietzsche uncovered extends beyond individual psychology into what might be called a conspiracy of comfort, a collective agreement to avoid the anxiety of freedom through increasingly sophisticated systems of predetermined meaning. This isn't a conscious conspiracy, but rather a cultural evolution driven by the human desire to avoid the fundamental burden of existence, the responsibility to create meaning in a world without predetermined purpose. In On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche traced how this conspiracy evolved through the development of religious and philosophical systems that displaced responsibility away from human choice. What began as simple animism evolved into increasingly sophisticated theological frameworks that provided comprehensive explanations for suffering, purpose, and meaning. Explanations that conveniently removed the burden of conscious creation from human shoulders. This cultural evolution wasn't driven by malicious intent, but by the basic human desire for psychological comfort. As Nietzsche writes in Human All Too Human, metaphysical explanations comfort humans where they and scientific investigation have not yet been able to light the way. The desire for comfort isn't inherently problematic. The issue arises when comfort comes at the cost of growth, authenticity, and the possibility of creating genuinely meaningful lives. What makes this pattern particularly compelling is how it persists even as traditional religious belief declines. Nietzsche observed how the same psychological mechanism, displacing responsibility onto external authorities that remove the burden of choice, continued through secular frameworks like deterministic science, historical inevitability, or social conditioning. Different language, same psychological function, avoiding the anxiety of freedom and the responsibility of creating meaning. This pattern reveals something profound about human psychology. Our tendency to seek refuge from the fundamental challenge of existence through systems of predetermined meaning, whether through religious concepts like God's will or secular notions like historical necessity. We develop increasingly sophisticated ways to avoid the terrifying freedom of conscious creation. The conspiracy extends into educational systems that often prioritize conformity over creative capacity, political frameworks that displace responsibility onto abstract systems, and therapeutic approaches that explain away rather than empower. Each domain develops its own language, but the psychological function remains consistent, avoiding the burden of conscious creation through appeals to external authorities or predetermined frameworks. What makes this pattern so powerful isn't any single manifestation, but its remarkable adaptability. As traditional religious frameworks lose cultural authority, the same psychological function continues through other channels: scientific determinism, technological inevitability, genetic predisposition, or social construction. Different language, same psychological comfort, the relief from the anxiety of freedom and the burden of creating meaning. This recognition reveals something unsettling about modern secularism, that it often continues the same psychological pattern while changing only the language. The person who says, "It's all determined by my genes," or "I'm just a product of my upbringing," is engaging in essentially the same psychological mechanism as the person who says, "It's God's will," displacing responsibility away from conscious choice onto external factors that conveniently remove the burden of freedom. Nietzsche's penetrating insight wasn't merely that religious belief might be false, but that it serves a psychological function that continues even as the specific concepts change. The real conspiracy isn't religious doctrine, but the deeper human tendency to avoid the fundamental challenge of existence, creating meaning in a world without predetermined purpose. This pattern raises profound questions about personal growth, social change, and the possibility of authentic living. If we've been collectively engaged in avoiding the anxiety of freedom through increasingly sophisticated systems of predetermined meaning, what might become possible if we consciously confronted this tendency? What version of humanity might emerge if we stepped out from behind these psychological shields and embraced the full responsibility of creating meaning in a world without predetermined purpose? As we continue our investigation, we'll explore why this pattern has remained largely unacknowledged and what it might mean for the possibility of genuine transformation, both individual and collective. Why has this psychological pattern remained largely unacknowledged despite its profound influence on human life? The answer isn't a conscious cover-up, but rather a collective avoidance driven by the basic human desire for psychological comfort. Confronting this pattern would mean facing the anxiety of freedom and the burden of creating meaning, precisely what the pattern evolved to help us avoid. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche offers a penetrating insight into this collective avoidance. The falseness of a judgment is not necessarily an objection to a judgment. The question is to what extent it is life-promoting, life-preserving, species-preserving, perhaps even species-cultivating. This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that beliefs persist not primarily because of their truth value, but because of their psychological utility. And few things are more psychologically useful than relief from the anxiety of freedom and the burden of conscious creation. Religious institutions have an obvious stake in maintaining the idea that divine will provides the ultimate framework for understanding purpose, meaning, and moral guidance. Acknowledging the psychological function of God's will as an excuse not to change would undermine the authority of religious frameworks and the comfort they provide. It's not that religious leaders consciously suppress this insight, but rather that their entire framework depends on maintaining the primacy of divine authority over human responsibility. Educational systems often perpetuate this pattern by prioritizing conformity to external standards over the development of creative capacity. As Nietzsche writes in Twilight of the Idols, the doer is merely a fiction added to the deed. The deed is everything. This insight reveals how educational frameworks often displace responsibility away from conscious choice onto external metrics that conveniently remove the burden of authentic creation. Political systems benefit from citizens who look to external authorities rather than recognizing their own capacity for social creation. Whether through appeals to tradition, national identity, or economic necessity, political frameworks often displace responsibility away from collective choice onto factors that conveniently remove the burden of conscious social arrangement. It's not a conscious conspiracy, but rather the natural evolution of systems that benefit from reduced responsibility. Perhaps most significantly, this pattern remains unacknowledged because confronting it would require facing what Nietzsche called the greatest weight, the recognition that there may be no predetermined plan guiding our lives, just our own choices, our own responsibility, and the meaning we ourselves create. This prospect is so psychologically challenging that most prefer the comfort of predetermined frameworks, even if they come at the cost of authentic living. The pattern persists not through conscious suppression, but through the simple human preference for comfort over growth, certainty over ambiguity, and predetermined meaning over the terrifying freedom of conscious creation. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, we have arranged for ourselves a world in which we can live, by positing bodies, lines, planes, causes and effects, motion and rest, form and content. Without these articles of faith, nobody could now endure life. But that does not prove them. Life is no argument. This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that we create frameworks that make life psychologically manageable. And few things are more psychologically challenging than facing the full weight of existence without the comfort of predetermined meaning. The pattern remains largely unacknowledged, not because of a conscious cover-up, but because acknowledging it would require confronting the very anxiety it evolved to help us avoid. What does this mean for the possibility of authentic personal growth and genuine social transformation? If we've been collectively engaged in avoiding the fundamental challenge of existence, what might become possible if we consciously confronted this tendency? What version of humanity might emerge if we stepped out from behind these psychological shields and embraced the full responsibility of creating meaning in a world without predetermined purpose? As we approach our final exploration, we'll examine what Nietzsche's discovery reveals about the possibility of genuine transformation and the path toward what he called becoming who you are, not through finding divine purpose, but through embracing the creative responsibility that defines authentic human existence. The final question isn't whether God exists, but whether we've been using the concept of God's will primarily as a shield against the anxiety of freedom and the burden of creating meaning. Nietzsche's discovery reveals something profound about human psychology, our tendency to seek refuge from the fundamental challenge of existence through appeals to predetermined meaning, but it also reveals something even more significant: the possibility of authentic living that emerges when we step out from behind these psychological shields and embrace the full responsibility of creating meaning in a world without predetermined purpose. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche articulates this possibility through his concept of the Übermensch, not a superior person in the crude sense, but rather a way of living that embraces the creative responsibility that defines authentic human existence. Man is something that shall be overcome, he writes. What have you done to overcome him? This question points to Nietzsche's recognition that authentic living requires overcoming our tendency to seek refuge in predetermined meaning, and instead embracing the creative responsibility that defines our humanity. This isn't about rejecting religious belief per se, but rather recognizing how concepts like God's will can function psychologically as excuses not to change, not to choose, not to face the terrifying freedom of creating one's own meaning. The real challenge isn't disbelief, but the courage to embrace responsibility even within frameworks of faith, to recognize that authentic spirituality might involve not the surrender of responsibility, but its fullest expression. What might this look like in practice? It means examining our language for patterns of avoidance, noticing when we invoke God's plan, destiny, or other concepts of predetermined meaning precisely when facing difficult choices or necessary changes. It means asking whether these invocations serve as genuine spiritual insights or as psychological shields against the anxiety of freedom and the burden of responsibility. It means recognizing when we use external authorities, whether divine, scientific, social, or political, to displace responsibility away from our own choices. It means noticing how often we say, "I can't," when what we really mean is, "I choose not to," and taking responsibility for these choices rather than hiding behind external factors that conveniently remove the burden of freedom. Most importantly, it means embracing what Nietzsche called amor fati, the love of fate not as predetermined destiny, but as the consequence of our own choices and the circumstances we cannot change. My formula for greatness in a human being, he writes in Ecce Homo, is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, not merely bear what is necessary, but love it. This isn't passive acceptance, but active embrace, taking responsibility not just for our choices, but for creating meaning in whatever circumstances we face. It means recognizing that God's will isn't a predetermined plan we must discover, but a creative possibility we help bring into existence through our choices, our values, and the meaning we ourselves create. The path forward isn't about rejecting faith, but transforming it, moving from a childish dependence on external authorities toward a mature recognition of our creative responsibility. Whether within religious frameworks or beyond them, authentic living requires embracing the fundamental challenge of human existence, creating meaning in a world without predetermined purpose. What might become possible if you stopped using God's will as an excuse and instead embraced the full responsibility of creating your life? What version of yourself might emerge if you stepped out from behind the shield of predetermined meaning and faced the terrifying freedom of conscious creation? What choices have you been avoiding through appeals to external authorities that conveniently remove the burden of responsibility? The answer to these questions won't come from external revelation, but from your own courageous confrontation with the fundamental challenge of existence. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, what does your conscience say? You shall become the person you are. And this isn't about discovering a predetermined essence, but creating yourself through choices that express your deepest values and aspirations. The real spiritual journey isn't finding God's predetermined plan for your life, but embracing the creative responsibility that defines authentic human existence. It's recognizing that meaning isn't something you discover, but something you create. Not alone, not arbitrarily, but in relationship with others and in response to the world you inhabit. Are you ready to stop using God as an excuse and start embracing the full responsibility of creating your life? The choice, as always, is yours.